The desert was still when the riders appeared on the horizon. Only the distant shimmer of heat over the sand and the faint drumming of hooves breaking the silence. The little frontier town sat half asleep under the late afternoon sun, its wooden buildings leaning tiredly against one another. Dogs barked. Children peeked from behind door frames until their mothers yanked them back. Everyone could tell something different was happening today. At the head of the procession rode two councilmen from the neighboring tribe, faces painted in solemn colors, eyes fixed forward. Behind them walked a young woman whose wrists were bound with rawhide rope. Her chin, however, was lifted high, too high for someone meant to be shamed. Her name was Naeli, daughter of the tribal chief. At 24, she had grown up surrounded by rules. What a woman should say, what she should hide, and most of all, whom she should never look at. Yet she had always been curious about the world beyond her people's campfires. One small conversation with a foreign trader, trading herbs for tools, had been enough to brand her a traitor. The rumors had grown faster than wildfire in dry brush. By the time the council met, the verdict had already been decided. She would be banished and given to a white man as punishment. Her father hadn't spoken in her defense. Her mother had turned her face away. Niley's pride was all she had left to hold. When the horses stopped in front of the town saloon, the councilman pulled her forward. The heat pressed against her bare shoulders. Dust clung to her torn deerskin dress. Eyes watched her from every doorway. Miners, drifters, the saloon girls leaning on the porch rail, whispering behind their fans. "This woman," one of the councilmen announced, his voice cutting through the dry air, "is no longer of our people. She is given to the white man," Rowan called her. A stir went through the crowd. Heads turned toward a man leaning against a weathered post near the water trough. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his hat shadowing most of his face. The sun caught on the faint scar along his jaw and the dull metal of a Union cavalry buckle at his belt. Rowan Calder, 38, a man who rarely came into town unless he had to. He'd fought through the war, seen men and horses bleed out under the same moonlight, and when it was over, he'd tried to build a quiet life. Fever had taken his wife and child 5 years earlier, leaving him with a house full of ghosts and a ranch full of work. He didn't want anyone's company, not neighbors, not strangers, and certainly not a woman handed to him like a piece of property. When his name was spoken, his stomach turned. "I didn't agree to this," he muttered, but no one listened. The councilman shoved the end of the rope into his palm. For a moment he stared at it, the thin strip of leather connecting two lives neither had chosen. Then with a flick of his knife, he cut it clean through. The rope fell, landing in the dust at Naeli's feet. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. The councilman stiffened. Naeli froze, wrists red where the rope had rubbed her skin raw. For the first time that day, she looked at him straight on. Her dark eyes burned with fury and something else, doubt mixed with defiance. Rowan said nothing. He turned, untied his horse, and held the reins out to her. "Get up," he said quietly. For a heartbeat, she hesitated, expecting another order, a shove, anything cruel. But his voice carried no threat, only patience and a tired kind of mercy. She climbed onto the horse, stiff-backed, refusing to let him see how much her legs trembled. The crowd watched in silence as they rode out of town, two shapes swallowed by the desert light. The ride was long and wordless. The wind stung Naeli's face, carrying the dry taste of dust and sage. Every hoofbeat echoed her thoughts. What now? The man beside her rode tall, his eyes fixed on the horizon, saying nothing. She hated the quiet almost as much as she hated the ropes that had marked her wrists. The council had wanted her broken. This silence, though, felt worse. It left her alone with her shame. When they finally reached Rowan's ranch, the sun was a low red coin sinking behind the hills. The cabin stood solitary, built of rough logs and stone, with a corral nearby and a single oak tree reaching stubbornly for shade. It wasn't much, but it was sturdy, the kind of place made by hands that didn't quit. Rowan swung off the horse and offered his hand to help her down. She ignored it, sliding off on her own, almost falling in the process. He didn't react, just nodded toward the cabin door. "Inside," he said. The room smelled of wood smoke, leather, and loneliness. A small stove sat in one corner, a narrow bed against the wall, and a table with two chairs that looked like they'd never both been used. Rowan set a bucket of water near her feet. "You can wash," he said. Then he sat heavily in the chair by the fire, boots planted firm on the floor. Nayeli crossed her arms, standing by the wall like a trapped animal. Every sound, the pop of the firewood, the creak of his chair, made her heart jump. She didn't know what kind of man he was. The world had shown her enough cruel ones to expect the worst. But Rowan didn't move toward her. He stared into the flames as if searching for something he'd lost long ago. Minutes dragged by. The tension in her chest eased just enough for her to breathe again. When he finally stood, she tensed. He reached for a blanket on the bed and spread it out on the floor near the stove. "You'll sleep there," he said. His voice was low, gravelly but even. Then rolling up his coat, he set it beside the blanket. "I'll take the bed." Nayeli blinked. It made no sense. Punishment was supposed to mean humiliation, pain. Yet this man, her so-called jailer, seemed determined to keep his distance. When he opened the door to fetch more wood, she flinched, expecting him to lock it from the outside. Instead, the sound of an axe striking echoed through the night, steady, rhythmic, the labor of someone cutting fuel for warmth. She sat down slowly on the blanket, firelight flickering across the cabin walls. Exhaustion pressed heavy behind her eyes. Still, she didn't dare sleep until she heard the door open again and his boots return across the floorboards. Rowan stacked the wood, washed his hands in the bucket, and lowered himself onto the bed without a word. For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was the uneven rhythm of two strangers breathing in the same small room. Dawn crept through the cracks in the shutters. When Nayeli opened her eyes, the space beside the fire was cold. Rowan was already outside. Through the window, she saw him at the well, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, drawing water with the quiet efficiency of habit. When he came back in, he placed a loaf of coarse bread on the table and tore it in half. "Eat," he said simply. She hesitated. Every act of kindness felt like a trick, but hunger won. She took a piece, eating slowly. He watched long enough to see her accept it, then turned his attention back to the stove. The silence between them was different now, less hostile, more uncertain. Two people orbiting around something neither dared name. Later that morning, he handed her a small pail. "Water the trough," he said, nodding toward the corral outside. She obeyed, though every muscle in her arms screamed from unfamiliar work. He didn't hover or command. He just worked beside her, moving with the same quiet rhythm as before. When the bucket slipped and water splashed her bare feet, she bit back a curse. Rowan glanced over, expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he took the bucket, refilled it, and handed it back. Their fingers brushed briefly. The contact was accidental, but it sent a strange shiver through her all the same. By midday, the desert sun burned hot overhead. She wiped sweat from her brow and looked toward him. He moved slower than before, his limp more noticeable. It struck her suddenly that his silence wasn't pride. It was pain. That night, as the fire crackled low, Nayeli sat by the stove mending the tear in her dress with a crooked needle she'd found in a box. Her hands trembled, clumsy from exhaustion. Rowan sat nearby, carving a piece of wood. The steady scrape of his knife filled the quiet. After a while, he asked without looking up, "Why did they send you?" She froze, needle halfway through the fabric. "They said I betrayed them," she answered softly. "I spoke with a traitor. That was enough." He nodded once, slow. The lines on his face deepened, shadows gathering around his eyes. "Doesn't sound like a crime worth hanging a life on," he said. She almost smiled, small and fleeting. "Among my people, sometimes words are heavier than bullets." Rowan didn't reply, but the next moment he pulled his coat from the hook and spread it across the floor again. "The bed's yours," he said. "Always will be." She wanted to ask why, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she lay down slowly, the firelight dancing across the ceiling beams. Outside, the wind moved across the desert like a sigh. Inside, for the first time since the council's decree, Nayeli closed her eyes and slept. Not in peace, but in something close enough to remember what peace once felt like. The second morning began with the same brittle chill that always slipped through the cracks of Rowan's cabin. Nayeli woke to the smell of smoke and coffee. The fire was already burning. The man was already working. It seemed he was always working. She sat up slowly on the bed he insisted was hers. The blanket still carried the faint scent of wood smoke and leather. For a moment she listened. The scrape of boots outside, the thud of wood on the chopping block, the low breath of a man used to talking only to himself. Everything about him felt controlled, measured, as if every sound he made had to earn its place in the quiet. When he stepped back inside, the cold followed him. He set a bucket of water on the table, then poured coffee into a tin cup and slid it toward her. "Still hot," he said. 2 words, nothing more. But it was the first time his tone had softened. She wrapped her hands around the cup, letting the heat seep into her fingers. Back in her village, men drank first and women waited. Here, he'd poured hers before his own. It felt strange, disarming. They ate in silence again, bread and a few strips of dried meat. Outside, the world was waking, coyotes crying far off, the wind brushing against the walls like a restless spirit. When Rowan finally spoke, it startled her. "You ever worked livestock before?" Nayeli shook her head. "Then today you'll learn." He handed her a pair of gloves that were too large for her hands. They smelled of sweat and saddle oil. She pulled them on anyway. He showed her how to scatter oats in the trough, how to fill the water barrels, how to latch the gate so the mule wouldn't nose it open. At first she fumbled with everything. The gloves slipped. The bucket was too heavy. Each mistake tightened the muscles in her back. She waited for the snap of his temper. It never came. Rowan only stepped beside her once, took her wrist gently, and adjusted her grip. "Like this," he said. His voice carried the low patience of a man who'd spent years teaching animals to listen. When she did it right, he gave a small nod and moved on. By noon, her arms burned, her hair stuck to her neck, and her deerskin dress was streaked with dust. Rowan worked beside her without complaint, sweat darkening the shoulders of his shirt. Sometimes he whistled, quiet and tuneless, like a memory half forgotten. It unsettled her. This man who had every right to own her but seemed determined not to. When the sun climbed higher, he called a break. They sat near the well, sharing the same canteen. The water was warm, metallic from the bucket, but it cooled her throat. She caught him studying the horizon instead of her, the way soldiers do when they can't stop seeing things far away. "Why do you live out here alone?" she asked before she could stop herself. He wiped sweat from his jaw with the back of his hand. "Because it's quiet." "That's all?" He hesitated. "Quiet's the only thing that doesn't lie." She didn't understand the words completely, but she felt their weight. She looked away toward the distant shimmer of heat above the sand, and for a moment neither of them spoke. That evening the wind rose. The air smelled of iron, the way it does before a desert storm. Rowan secured the shutters while Nayeli gathered the few loose things on the shelves. When the first gust hit, dust swirled through the cracks, and the old cabin groaned like a tired animal. Inside, the space between them felt smaller, the air thicker. The storm outside was loud enough to swallow any words. She sat by the fire, brushing her long dark hair, still damp from the wash bucket. Rowan sat across the room, mending a harness strap, the firelight flickering against the scar that cut across his temple. When thunder rolled over the hills, she flinched. He noticed. "Doesn't last long," he said quietly. She nodded but didn't answer. Silence settled again, except for the wind clawing at the roof. It reminded her of the night the council tied her wrists, the sound of angry voices rising over the storm. Her throat tightened. She didn't want to remember, but memories came like rain through a leaky roof, unstoppable once they started. Rowan's chair creaked. "You look like someone seeing ghosts," he said. "Maybe I am." He studied her for a long moment, then went back to stitching the leather. After a while, he said, "They can't touch you here. You think ghosts listen to walls?" He gave a faint half smile. "No, but they get quieter when there's work to do." By morning, the storm had passed. The air smelled clean, washed by sand and lightning. The chores started again, hauling wood, checking fences, feeding the animals that had spooked overnight. Every task was new to her, but she copied his movements until her muscles learned the rhythm. Around midday, she stumbled while lifting a feed sack. Rowan caught it before it hit the ground. His hands closed around hers, rough and warm. The moment stretched, too long, too quiet. She pulled back first, heart pounding. He said nothing, only returned to work. But the air between them changed. Something fragile had cracked open, and neither knew what to do with it. That night, while she mended her dress again, Rowan spoke without looking up. "You don't have to keep fixing that. It's worn through." "It's the only one I have," she said. He got up, opened the trunk by the bed, and pulled out a faded flannel shirt. The fabric was soft from age, patched at one elbow. He held it out awkwardly. "This'll fit better." Nellie stared at it, then at him. You give me your clothes now? Seems better than watching you freeze. She took it carefully like it might vanish. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me, just wear it. When she slipped it on, the sleeves hung long over her wrists, but the fabric was warm and smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. For the first time since she'd left her tribe, she felt covered, not only in body but in dignity. The days began to fall into a rhythm. Work at dawn, chores until dusk, small words traded like rare coins. She learned how to guide the mule with a firm voice, how to carry water without spilling half of it, how to tell when a storm was coming by the color of the sky. Rowan, for his part, started leaving his door unlatched when he went to the barn, a quiet sign that he trusted her not to run. Trust. It was a strange word. Stranger still was the warmth that crept into the silence each night when they sat near the fire. Sometimes he told her about the land, how he'd bought it with army pay, how the well ran dry the first year and he almost left. He never spoke of the war or of the graves behind the cabin, but she didn't press. Some wounds were easier to feel than to name. One evening, as the sun bled red across the desert, Nayeli stood outside the cabin, watching the light fade. Rowan came up behind her, carrying a bucket of water. The colors painted his face gold and scarlet. He stopped beside her without speaking. For a long time, they both just stood there, listening to the wind whisper through the grass. Back home, she said softly. Sunset meant the spirits were walking. He glanced at her. What does it mean here? She thought for a moment. Maybe that the day did what it could. He nodded. Well, good enough. That night, she dreamed of ropes falling, of hands that didn't hurt, of a voice saying, you can stay. When she woke, the fire had burned low, and Rowan was still in his chair, asleep upright, the knife he'd been sharpening lying across his lap. The sight startled her. The man who had once terrified her now looked almost human, almost peaceful. She rose quietly, draped his coat over his shoulders, and sat back down near the fire. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of the silence. It had changed shape. It no longer held the threat of what might happen. It held the echo of what already had. The first small piece of trust built between two people no one else wanted. Outside, dawn broke over the desert, pale and merciful. The punishment the council had meant to destroy her had instead carried her to a place where she was finally beginning to breathe again. She didn't know what the coming days would bring, but for now that was enough. The morning sun came early that week, pouring over the desert like melted copper. Rowan was already outside by the time Nayeli woke. Through the window, she saw him at the corral, moving with that same quiet precision that had begun to fascinate her. Every motion was deliberate, measured, almost ritual. She pulled on the flannel shirt he'd given her, rolling the sleeves past her wrists. The fabric was still too big, but she liked the way it smelled. Smoke, sweat, and something steady. It reminded her of safety, though she'd never used that word out loud. When she stepped outside, he didn't look up right away. Grab the feed bucket, he said. His tone was calm, not commanding. She obeyed, filling the trough while he fixed a loose hinge on the corral gate. The rhythm of their work had started to blend. His silence no longer felt heavy, hers no longer defiant. After a while, she noticed him favoring his right leg again. The limp grew sharper as the day stretched on. She set the bucket down and wiped her forehead. You're hurt, she said quietly. Rowan straightened, testing his weight on the leg. Old wound, he replied. Don't fuss over it. But she couldn't ignore the way he winced when he turned. She took a hesitant step closer. Does it always hurt? He paused, hammer in hand. Most days, some worse. Something about the way he said it, plain without complaint, made her chest ache. Back in her village, pain was something hidden or punished. Here he carried it openly, like a badge no one wanted but everyone earned. By mid-morning, the heat was sharp enough to sting. Rowan motioned toward the barn. Come on, we'll fix that loose beam before it falls on us. Inside, the light came through the gaps in the roof, stripes of gold cutting through the dust. The scent of hay and leather filled the air. Rowan climbed halfway up a ladder, testing the beam. Hold it steady, he told her. She reached up, gripping the rough wood. The muscles in her arms trembled, but she refused to show weakness. He leaned in to adjust the plank, his shoulder brushing hers. For a moment, neither moved. The sound of their breathing filled the small space. Two people learning that closeness didn't always mean danger. When the beam settled into place, Rowan stepped back, wiping his hands on his jeans. You're stronger than you look. She gave him a sharp glance. That's supposed to be a compliment? He smirked, faint and fleeting. Supposed to be the truth? It was the first time she'd seen his mouth hint at a smile. It changed his whole face, made him look less like the ghost of a soldier and more like the man he might have been before the war. That afternoon, they worked the fence line together. She carried nails in a tin pail while he hammered. Every few minutes, he'd glance over his shoulder to check her progress, not out of distrust, but quiet habit. When her grip slipped and the pail clattered, she muttered something under her breath in her own language. Rowan's brow furrowed. Hun. What did you say? Words you don't need to know, she said, chin lifted. He chuckled softly. Fair enough. The sound startled her. A real laugh, low and genuine. It caught her off guard more than anger ever could. They finished the fence by dusk. The sky burned orange, then violet. Sweat darkened the collar of his shirt. Dust clung to her hair. When he handed her a canteen, their fingers brushed again, and she didn't pull away this time. Dinner was simple: beans, coffee, a heel of bread. They sat at the table instead of opposite corners of the room. The air carried that same uncertain quiet, but it was different now. Less like fear, more like a truce. Niley watched him clean his rifle after they ate. His movements were methodical, almost gentle, as if the weapon were a thing of ceremony. You fought in the war, she said softly. He nodded once. Cavalry, rode for the Union. You killed men. He didn't look up. Too many. And you came back to this? She asked, glancing around the one-room cabin. This, he said, setting the rifle aside, is quiet. Quiet doesn't ask questions. She studied him for a long moment, then said, Quiet can be lonely. He met her gaze finally. You'd know about that. She looked down, twisting a thread loose from the sleeve of the flannel. Yes, I would. For a few seconds, the fire cracked between them. Then he reached into the trunk again, pulled out a small tin, and set it on the table. Inside were a few folded papers, letters yellowed with age, corners worn. He didn't open them, just stared at them as if they might speak. My wife used to write, he said quietly. After the fever took her and the boy, I stopped reading the rest. Niley's throat tightened. She wanted to reach across the table to say something, anything, but no words felt right. All she could manage was, I'm sorry. He nodded, eyes still on the tin. So am I. Later that night, when he rolled out his coat on the floor as always, she hesitated. You can take the bed, she said. He shook his head. Already told you, it's yours. It's not, she said softly. It was yours long before I came. Rowan looked up at her, something unreadable in his expression. Doesn't mean I want it back. The silence that followed was heavy but not hostile. She lay down and turned toward the wall. The sound of his breathing, steady and close, was strangely comforting. She didn't know when she fell asleep, only that, for the first time, she didn't dream of ropes or punishment. The next morning dawned cool, rare for the desert. The smell of rain lingered from somewhere far off. Rowan was already at the stove, stirring coffee. You slept through a thunderclap, he said, almost teasing. She blinked, rubbing her eyes. Maybe I'm getting used to your storms. He raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. He poured her a cup first again, then his own. They ate in companionable quiet, the kind that comes when words aren't needed. When breakfast was done, he handed her a piece of sandpaper. Here, he said, you can help me clean the tack. Keeps it from cracking. They spent the morning in the barn side by side, polishing leather straps and saddles. The smell of oil and dust filled the air. She found the rhythm of it calming, the scrape of sandpaper, the faint hum of his low whistle. At one point, she said, Why did you really take me that day? You could have refused. He paused, hands still on the saddle. If I'd refused, they would have given you to someone else, someone who wouldn't have cut the rope. She looked at him then, seeing not pity but conviction. You didn't want me, she said quietly. No, he admitted, but I didn't want to watch them destroy you either. Her chest tightened. And now? He hesitated, eyes fixed on the saddle in front of him. Now I'm trying to figure out what either of us is supposed to be. She didn't press further. Some answers took longer than a single morning to find. That evening, when the sky turned indigo, they sat by the fire again. Rowan had traded his hammer for a book, its spine cracked, pages yellow. He read silently, lips barely moving. Niley mended the same sleeve she always did, though it no longer needed it. After a while, she asked, What are you reading? He looked up, surprised. A story about a man who leaves home and spends the rest of his life trying to find his way back. Does he? Not yet, he said, closing the book halfway. Maybe that's the point. She smiled faintly. Maybe he already did and just didn't know it. Rowan studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Maybe. When she went to bed that night, the air felt different, gentler somehow. He still lay on the floor, but closer to the fire now, his arm draped over his eyes. In the faint light, she could see the scars along his knuckles, the small twitch of his jaw when he dreamed. Without thinking, she whispered, "Good night, Rowan." He didn't answer, but a small sound, half sigh, half hum, carried through the room. It was enough. Outside, the desert was silent again. Inside, something was shifting, slow and sure, like the land after rain. Respect had found its roots. Recognition was starting to bloom. Neither of them could name it yet, but both could feel it, growing quietly in the space between two wounded hearts that, against every odd, had begun to beat in rhythm. By the time summer rolled across the desert, the air had turned dry enough to sting the lungs. The mornings came early, and the nights felt endless. Life at Rowan's cabin had fallen into its own rhythm. Two people who rarely spoke, yet somehow moved in sync. Every day had its order. He rose before dawn. She started the fire. He worked the fences. She tended to the livestock. They ate side by side, said little, and filled the silence with the steady hum of work. But beneath that quiet routine, something had begun to shift, something neither of them could stop or name. One morning, Naomi found him by the corral, fixing the same hinge she'd seen him repair weeks ago. The sun caught the edge of his jaw, the sweat glistening against his neck. He looked older and stronger at once, a man built from solitude. She crossed her arms. "You fix that thing more than you break it." He didn't look up. "Gives my hand something to do." "And your mind?" He paused mid-swing, the hammer hovering over the nail. "That's harder to fix." She watched him for a long moment, feeling the weight of his words. There was a loneliness in him that mirrored her own, something she recognized but couldn't quite reach. When the hammer fell again, the sound echoed off the boards like a heartbeat. That afternoon, they rode into town for supplies, their first trip together since the day she'd been delivered to him. Naomi's stomach tightened at the thought. The last time she'd been there, her wrists had been bound, her name a curse whispered on the wind. Rowan noticed her silence as they saddled the horses. "You don't have to go in," he said. "I'm not hiding," she answered. He gave a short nod. "Didn't think you would." The ride took half a day. The desert stretched wide and merciless, the sky a hard blue that left no room for doubt. When they reached the edge of town, heads turned. People remembered. Some looked away out of shame. Others stared like they were still waiting for a show. Naomi kept her chin up. She had been paraded once through this same street, shame before strangers. She wouldn't bow her head again. Inside the general store, the clerk barely met her eyes. Rowan gathered what he needed: flour, coffee, salt, moving with the quiet authority of a man used to being left alone. When he handed over payment, the clerk's gaze flicked toward Naomi. "That her?" he muttered. Rowan's voice dropped low. "She's with me." The man said nothing after that. Outside, two ranch hands leaned near the well, their voices low but loud enough to reach her. One of them smirked. "Guess the old soldier found himself a souvenir." Rowan turned his head slowly. His eyes, usually calm, went sharp. "You got something worth saying?" The smirk faltered. The men stepped back. Naomi stood frozen beside the horses, heart pounding. Rowan didn't touch her or speak, but his presence, the way he held himself between her and the world, felt like a shield. On the ride home, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the creak of leather and the rhythm of hooves. But when the cabin finally came into view, Naomi broke the silence. "They still hate me," she said quietly. Rowan's voice came steady, almost gentle. "Then let them. You're not theirs anymore." She turned to him. "And who am I then?" He hesitated, jaw tight. "You're you, that's enough." The answer shouldn't have meant so much, but it did. That evening, the fire burned low, throwing soft light across the cabin walls. Naomi stood by the stove, stirring a pot of beans. The smell filled the room, smoke, cumin, and something warm that reminded her of home. Rowan sat nearby, cleaning his tools, his shoulders heavy with the day's weight. She served the food without a word. They ate in silence. When she finally looked up, his eyes were already on her. "What?" she asked. He shook his head. "Nothing." But he didn't look away. The air between them thickened. Something unspoken moved through it. Curiosity, maybe fear, maybe something stronger. After a long silence, she asked softly, "Why haven't you ever touched me?" His jaw flexed. "Because I won't be the chain they put on you." She swallowed hard. "You're not." "Doesn't feel that simple," he said. His voice carried that quiet, ragged edge she'd come to recognize, the sound of a man at war with himself. Niley stood, her pulse quickening. The fire crackled between them, painting his face in shades of amber and shadow. "Then let me choose," she said. He looked up, startled. "You said you wouldn't be my chain. So let me decide what I want." Rowan rose slowly from his chair, the floor creaking beneath his boots. He was close enough for her to feel the heat radiating from his skin, the scent of leather and smoke. "You don't know what you're asking," he said, voice low. "I do," she whispered. "For the first time I do." For a heartbeat, neither moved. The fire popped, sending sparks into the air. Then carefully, as though testing the truth of the moment, he reached out. His calloused fingers brushed her cheek. She didn't flinch. The world outside vanished. The desert, the past, the punishment. All that existed was the quiet between their breaths. When he bent his head, his lips barely grazed hers. It was a question, not a claim. She answered by closing the distance. The kiss was soft, unhurried, filled with everything they hadn't said for weeks. His hand moved to the back of her neck, steady and protective. She pressed closer, the fabric of his shirt rough against her skin. For the first time since she'd been exiled, her body felt like it belonged to her again. Not as something taken, but as something freely given. When they pulled apart, Rowan's breath was uneven. "This changes things," he said. Niley smiled faintly. "It already has." That night, she didn't take the bed alone. She lay beside him, her back against his chest, the rhythm of his heartbeat steady beneath her ear. His arm rested lightly across her waist, protective, but never possessive. Neither spoke. The silence was full but peaceful, the kind that needed no words. Outside, the desert wind whispered against the walls. Inside, two people who had been handed punishment found something neither had expected: mercy. The next morning, the world felt different. The light through the window was softer, the air cooler. Rowan rose early as always, but his movements were slower now, more uncertain. Niley woke to the sound of water pouring into the stovetop. He didn't look at her at first, as if unsure what came after the night before. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders. "Morning," she said quietly. He nodded. "Coffee's on." They ate in silence, the kind that wasn't awkward, but careful. Every glance carried the weight of something new, fragile, real, and impossible to ignore. After breakfast, Rowan went outside to check the fence. Nayeli followed, helping without being asked. Their hands brushed over the same tool, and he froze. "You don't have to work today," he said. "I want to," she answered. He looked at her then, his gaze holding something deeper than gratitude. Maybe fear, maybe faith. As the sun climbed, they rested under the oak tree behind the cabin. Rowan leaned against the trunk, his hat tilted low, eyes half closed. Nayeli sat beside him, knees drawn up, tracing patterns in the dirt. "Do you ever think about leaving this place?" she asked. He hesitated. "I used to, not anymore." "Why not?" "Because for the first time, it doesn't feel empty." The words hung between them, heavier than air. She turned her head, watching him. The line of his jaw, the shadow beneath his hat, the scar she'd once thought made him look dangerous. Now it made him look real. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his hand. He didn't move away. "I was supposed to be destroyed," she said softly. He opened his eyes. "Not here." And just like that, the distance that had once felt endless vanished. They sat in silence until the sun dipped low, its light washing the desert gold. In that quiet, Nayeli realized the truth she hadn't dared to name. She no longer lived in punishment. She lived in choice. And choice, she thought, was the only kind of freedom worth fighting for. The dawn that followed felt different. The fire had burned down to faint embers, and the desert wind was cool, carrying a hint of rain from somewhere far off. Nayeli stirred against Rowan's chest, the rhythm of his breathing steady beneath her cheek. For the first time since she'd been banished, she didn't wake to fear. She woke to warmth. Rowan shifted, sitting up on the edge of the bed. The early light fell across his shoulders, tracing the scars she had learned not to flinch at. He rubbed a hand over his face, as if unsure whether the peace of the night before was something real or just another dream he didn't deserve. "Morning," she whispered. He looked back at her, eyes softer than she'd ever seen. "Morning." For a moment, the silence between them held everything words could ruin. The memory of her hand in his, her choice, his restraint finally breaking into something tender. But the stillness didn't last. Out here, peace never did. By midday, the horizon was crawling with dust. Rowan saw it first, the faint shimmer of movement far beyond the corral. He set down the feed bucket, squinting into the glare. 4 riders. 2 of them carried the long braids and painted faces of her people. Nellie froze beside him. "They came back," she murmured. He said nothing at first, only reached for the rifle leaning by the post. "Stay inside." She caught his arm. "No, if they came for me, I'll face them." He looked at her then. Really looked, the way a man does before stepping into something he can't take back. "You sure?" She nodded. "Running won't change what I am." The riders approached fast, their horses kicking up dust. When they stopped, one dismounted. A man older than the rest, his hair streaked with gray, his face carved with lines of authority. Niley knew him. He was the council's spokesman, the one who had declared her punishment. "You will come with her," he said, voice cold as stone. "Your debt is paid. The council has decided your exile is over." Rowan stood between them. "She's not going anywhere unless she wants to." The man's eyes hardened. "This isn't your matter, white man. You were her sentence." Rowan didn't flinch. "Maybe, but she's more than a sentence now." The riders shifted uneasily, hands brushing their weapons. The air was tight enough to break. Niley stepped forward past Rowan's shoulder. "I won't go," she said. "You threw me away once. You don't get to call me back when it suits your pride. You dishonored your people," the elder spat. "You spoke with outsiders. You let shame touch your family's name. And what did that punishment make of me?" she asked. "You wanted me destroyed. Instead, I learned to live." The man's jaw clenched. For a moment, the desert held its breath. Then he said, "If you stay, you are no longer one of us." Niley's eyes burned, but her voice stayed steady. "Then I'll be no one's daughter but my own?" The elder mounted his horse without another word. The riders turned and vanished into the dust they'd come from. When the last hoofbeat faded, the silence was heavier than before. Rowan lowered the rifle but didn't put it down. "You meant it," he said quietly. "Every word." She nodded. "I did." Something flickered across his face. Pride, sadness, maybe relief. "Then they won't be back." "Good," she whispered. "I don't belong there anymore." He set the rifle aside, wiping a hand across the back of his neck. "You belong here then?" Niley looked around. The cabin, the corral, the wide stretch of desert that had once felt like a prison. "If you'll have me." Rowan hesitated. "I don't own you." "I didn't say you did," she said, smiling faintly. "I said if you'll have me." He gave a slow nod. "Then I guess this is home." The days that followed were quieter. The work didn't change. The fences still needed mending. The horses still needed water. But the silence between them did. It was softer now, threaded with the rhythm of shared purpose. Some nights they talked by the fire. Naley told him about her childhood, the river she used to swim in, the songs her mother sang when storms came. Rowan spoke of his wife and son, the fever that took them, and the grave he'd dug with his own hands. The pain in his voice didn't sound like confession. It sounded like surrender, the kind that heals. One evening after the day's chores, they sat under the oak tree, watching the sky bleed into color. The light wrapped the land in gold. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Nayeli said, "You ever wonder why the council chose you?" He shrugged. "Maybe they thought I was already halfway dead." "And are you?" He looked down at his hands, rough and scarred. "Not anymore." She smiled. "Then maybe they chose right." That night, the first storm of summer rolled in from the west. The wind howled against the cabin walls, rattling the shutters. Rain came hard and sudden, drumming the roof like 1,000 drums. Nally lit the lanterns while Rowan secured the door. "It'll pass," he said. "I like the sound," she answered. "Reminds me of the monsoons back home." He poured coffee into 2 tin mugs and handed her one. "You think you'll ever miss it? The tribe, the life before?" She thought for a moment, watching the rain slide down the window pane. "Maybe the parts that were never mine to begin with, but not what they made of me." He nodded, then said softly, "You've got a strength I don't think they ever understood." "Neither did you," she teased. He grinned, an actual grin, rare and unguarded. "Guess I'm still learning." They drank in silence for a while, the storm echoing like distant thunder in their chests. When morning came, the world smelled of wet dust and new beginnings. The storm had stripped the desert clean, left everything shining. Rowan stepped outside, boots sinking slightly in the soft earth. Nayeli followed, the hem of her borrowed shirt brushing her knees. "Looks different," she said. "Always does after rain," he replied. "The land remembers how to breathe." She watched him for a long time, the wind tugging at her hair. "So do we." Rowan met her eyes. "Yeah, guess we do." He reached for her hand, fingers rough but steady. She laced hers through his without hesitation. Together they stood in the open air, two souls rebuilt from dust and punishment and grace. The world around them was the same, dry, endless, unforgiving. But inside that small circle of touch, everything had changed. That evening, as the sun sank low, Rowan sat by the fire, sharpening his knife while Nayeli stitched the tear in his shirt. The sound of the blade against stone mixed with the quiet crackle of burning wood. "You ever think you'll go back east?" she asked. He shook his head. "I buried that life long ago." "And me? You ever wish I'd gone back with them?" He looked up, his gaze steady. "If I said yes, it'd be a lie." She smiled. "Then don't." He set the knife down and leaned back in his chair. "You ever notice it," he said, "how the desert looks empty until you learn where to look?" Natalie nodded. "Like people." He smiled at that, a slow, knowing smile. "Exactly like people." The night deepened. Coyotes called somewhere beyond the hills. The stars came out, bright, endless, unashamed. Rowan reached over and covered her hand with his. "You ever think," he said quietly, "that what they meant as punishment was really a rescue neither of us saw coming?" Natalie's eyes shimmered in the firelight. "Maybe mercy just wears strange clothes." He laughed softly, shaking his head. "I'll drink to that." She leaned closer, resting her head against his shoulder. For a while they sat in silence, listening to the world settle around them. No council, no tribe, no war, just the desert, the wind, and the steady pulse of something that finally felt like belonging. Outside, the land stretched wide and open, endless as forgiveness. The same sun that once burned them now warmed their faces. The same wind that once carried exile now whispered home. Rowan looked toward the horizon. "Funny thing about punishment," he said. "Sometimes it's just a road that takes the long way to redemption." Nayeli smiled. "Then I'm glad I walked it with you." The fire popped, throwing sparks into the dark. She reached for his hand again, holding it firm. Together they watched the last of the light fade behind the hills, their past gone with it. Somewhere out there, the council still believed they'd broken her. The war still haunted him. But here, in the quiet heart of the desert, two people once condemned had built something the world couldn't take away. Love, choice, peace. And maybe that's the question left for us. Watching their story fade into dusk. When the world tells you who you're supposed to be, would you have the courage to choose who you truly are?